So it was recently revealed that the Church of England had nominated a woman named Sarah Mullally to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury, which has been traditionally viewed as, the highest clerical position within Anglicanism. And this is already sending shockwaves through the broader Anglican communion with an almost certain likelihood of schism and rupture. And what's crazy about this is that they had to know that this would be the effect. They had to know that if they went forward with this agenda, that it would rupture whatever unity was left in the Anglican communion, especially with the Global South, which tends to be much more traditional. But they went ahead with the program and the agenda anyway, obviously holding this progressive agenda as a greater good than the unity of their church community. And this got me thinking about the many, many times in which conservative leaders within the Catholic Church could have pushed hard in the direction they wanted to go and not only took their foot off the pedal, but even sometimes went in the other direction. And the rationale that is so often given is because they don't or they didn't want to cause a schism. They value unity over their own agenda. And this would explain why both John Paul II and Benedict XVI not only avoided pressing too hard in a traditional direction, but even promoted and appointed, liberal bishops when they could have stacked the College of Cardinals in their favor and secured a much more conservative character for the future of the church. But they didn't do that, which says a lot. It says that conservatives are more motivated by common good and by unity than they are by ideology. And you see this all the time. It's one of the great frustrations of being a conservative. Whenever conservative politicians get elected, they often take a, conservative approach to their agenda. They don't go in with like a radical push in the direction that favors their beliefs. They go gently or slowly or often not at all. Many conservative leaders will take a this far and no further approach in which progressives will push things in the direction they want when they're in power, and then conservatives will get in and say, okay, no further, until progressives get back in and push things again. And then the conservatives try to hold the line again, which is obviously a strategy doomed to fail, like a football team whose only strategy is defensive, but never tries to move the ball in the other direction. And I'd say we've seen too much of this within the church. There was a period of extremely traditional popes in the late 19th century and the early 20th century who taught a lot about looming threats to the integrity of the church. But you could argue that they didn't do enough to root out bad actors who were intent on modernizing the church. Meanwhile, as soon as progressives got a hold of things in the middle of the 20th century, they pursued a radical agenda of change in the church, change that was so disruptive that it immediately led to the evacuation of people from the priesthood, from religious orders, and from the pews. And by the way, whenever someone points that out, you always get people responding with the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, which means that just because some event happened after another event doesn't mean that the former event caused the latter, which is similar to saying that correlation doesn't equal causation, which is true. But some correlations are so dramatic that you can't help but attribute cause to them. Like, for example, 2,000 years of Catholic identity that saw itself as a single thing, and then almost overnight, they get this effect in which Catholics find themselves divided on all kinds of things, and nobody seems to have a monopoly on what is the true Catholic understanding, which persists to this day. But aside from that dramatic correlation, a recent paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research actually confirmed that Vatican II triggered a decline in Catholic attendance relative to other denominations. Relative to other denominations is a really important insight there. In other words, it wasn't just correlation, it was cause. And I'm not anti-Vatican II. I've read the constitutions, I was edified by them, and I placed myself under them. But you have to admit that the changes that it ushered in were so dramatic that it should have been no surprise that people would feel orphaned by their religion, which is, again, a cost that progressives were willing to pay. Conservatives would never do that. We talk a lot about the state of the church in Germany, for example, where the bishops are openly denouncing Catholic teachings on a whole range of things, but especially on marriage and sexuality. There was even a bishop recently caught or exposed for having gotten married, and yet nobody's been excommunicated. Nobody's brought the hammer down on these guys. And the rationale is always because it would cause a schism, which we want to avoid. It shows that conservatives, by and large, would rather live with the progressives and work towards solutions than split apart and simply enjoy like a more harmonious climate. We've even seen this on social media. As the more established platforms like Facebook and Twitter became more regulated, especially in terms of what you could and couldn't say, a lot of conservatives were feeling increasingly left out, if not censored. And the reaction from people on the left was always, hey, if you don't like it, go start your own. But the conservatives didn't want to do that. They wanted to participate in the conversations on those platforms, whereas the progressives just seemed to want to get rid of the conservatives. So, in desperation, some conservatives did go and start their own platform. After getting kicked off and censored on Twitter, some got together and started a platform called Parler, which eventually became the most popular app on the App Store, topping Twitter and TikTok. So, in reaction, the big tech platforms insisted that Parler start censoring speech on its platform. And when they refused, they were removed from the app stores. After Twitter was bought out by Elon Musk and he adopted a more liberal free speech policy, conservatives then flooded back to the platform, again showing that they wanted to engage with conservatives and aren't so intolerant or divisive as they are popularly portrayed. And what did people on the left do? They started abandoning Twitter and went running to apps like Blue Sky, where they could continue to live in their own echo chambers. Another striking piece of evidence is a Pew Research study that found that when singles were asked if they'd be willing to date someone who voted for the opposite party that they did, Democrat supporters overwhelmingly said no. 71% actually, whereas Republicans supporters were only 47%, all of which reveals some important insights. The disagreements between progressives and conservatives are only disagreements for most conservatives. Conservatives disagree with progressives, but they are still willing to engage with them, are still willing to live in community with them, whether political or ecclesiastical. But progressives, for the most part, don't just disagree with conservatives, they hate them. They can't tolerate them. And again, just look at the Charlie Kirk incident. He was someone who was willing to go out and interact with people who didn't just disagree with him, they were hostile towards him, even knowing that his life was in danger in doing so because he would routinely wear a bulletproof vest. But he still went out and tried to dialogue with people on the other side and eventually paid for it with his life. I'd say that the trend is that conservatives will engage with progressives in the hopes of trying to find common ground or to see eye to eye, but progressives will either censor them, remove them, or failing all of that, go find their own thing where conservatives just aren't welcome. It shows that conservatives disagree, but are more likely going to be motivated by goodwill. Progressives, on the other hand, are more likely to disagree and be motivated by malice. And that again brings us back to the situation in the church. Conservative church leaders again refuse to push their agenda or their beliefs too hard because they don't want to alienate those who disagree with them. And in the case of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, they'll even promote those that they disagree with to high-ranking positions, people like Theodore McCarrick, Reinhard Marx and Walter Casper. Whereas progressives, as evidenced by the case of the new Archbishop of Canterbury, will pursue their agenda at all costs, placing a higher premium on their ideology than on cohesion or peace or stability or just the good of the institution of the church body. They'd rather rule the ashes of a community or an institution that reflects their ideals than ensure its survival or even recovery by allowing for a plurality of voices and visions within the community, which is either extreme hubris and ignorance or just plain old malice. They're utterly and fanatically devoted to their own sense of superior beliefs, even when those beliefs are clearly destructive when applied in the real world. As a Canadian, I think of Justin Trudeau, the recently displaced Prime Minister of Canada. After bankrupting this country, after countless scandals and ethics violations, after overseeing a rapid increase of crime, homelessness, drug addiction, and the collapse of the Canadian economy, he recently went on Twitter to memorialize his election 15 years ago and to insist that he's proud of having made Canada a better place, which no sane person would agree with that. He dramatically set this country back. And it might even be true that he's sincere, that he really thinks he did a good job, because while the average Canadian was undeniably harmed by his policies, if he can reassure himself that he stayed true to his ideals, which he never doubts because he never compares those ideals with the effect they have when actually applied, then it makes sense that he would just continue to congratulate himself. And I've had plenty of personal experience of what I'm talking about. I've had a lot of people who were longtime personal relationships cut off communication with me simply for my beliefs. And these are people who I recognize I disagree with. And in fact, because I have what I would describe as a more strict moral standard, it would make sense that I would be more offended by their beliefs. But I was always still willing to keep those connections alive. I've also seen it in institutions in the church. I can think of one that I was involved in that was frankly on life support when I initially got involved, and was extremely progressive historically. And then, the strangest thing happened. New people started getting involved, casting a new vision for renewal, and it worked. People started taking an interest and enrollment was up, but the old progressive guard didn't like the new conservative direction, even though it was making the institution financially viable again. So looking at the alternatives, which were allow conservative voices to work in the institution, which will lead to its prosperity, or block their efforts and revert back to a dying, if not dead, institution, they chose the latter. They chose violence. They removed all the conservatives they didn't like, and they got their wish. They now occupy an echo chamber that also happens to be something like a tomb. So what are the takeaways from all of this? The first might be that the stereotypes of the tolerant and inclusive progressives and the intolerant and hostile conservatives are just total nonsense. The exact opposite is more often the truth of the matter. And even if both progressives and conservatives demonstrated a mutual amount of hostility for each other, at least the conservatives don't congratulate themselves for being the tolerant and accepting ones, which is what liberals constantly do. They will denounce you while at the same time describing themselves as tolerant. I guess another takeaway is that I think conservatives should reevaluate their approach to tolerance. When you're willing to tolerate someone who's committed to your deletion and an ideological direction that will destroy whatever it is that you've been working to build, what are you gaining by that? If it only ever means that as soon as they get the upper hand in any community, any institution, or any church, they'll pursue their ideological objectives even when they are clearly self-destructive, and they won't care when the whole thing comes crashing down. If the motivation is that for the sake of unity, we won't push our agenda too hard, but in so doing, we allow those who will push their agenda as hard as they can to lie in wait for their opportunity, the inevitable outcome is the rupture of unity. You haven't saved anything by tolerating rivals who have shown time and again that what they want is disunity, or at least they're willing to sacrifice unity in pursuit of their ideology. Including their voice in the overall conversation is only ever going to be disruptive. So I think conservatives, especially in the church, need to push harder. They need to move the ball in the other direction, and they need to actually fight back against subversive elements and personalities who undermine church teaching and the integrity of its community and its institutions. Stop including modernists at the table. Recover the ancient church's fortitude and willingness to anathematize error and evil wherever it exists. And don't be persuaded that this is somehow uncharitable. It is a duty of love to reject what is wrong and evil. It is a duty of love to be good stewards of whatever has been entrusted to you. It is a duty of love to ensure that people aren't being deceived or led astray, and that their institutions, which they've often established themselves with their own hard work and money, are not destroyed by people motivated by blind ideology and often nothing else. So, no matter how bleak the decline of society could get, the one thing I'm always encouraged by is faith-filled families reproducing a generation who can turn the boat around. But that can't happen if Catholics aren't getting married and having those babies, which is easier said than done in today's world. I'm constantly hearing reports from young people who are saying how hard it is to find good matches with other faithful Catholics. And while there's no silver bullet solution to those challenges, I've had the chance to get to know the people at Catholic Match, and I can honestly recommend them as a company who is intentionally doing everything they can to create tools to help people move towards sacramental marriages. I personally know of couples who met that way and have been happily married for years since. So please don't give up on holding out for a Catholic Match. It's worth a try if you haven't already, and if you have, I would say give it another try and see if God's providence will conspire to your benefit. Just download their app or head over to catholicmatch.com.